So you've touched on it very briefly, but let's go into that in more detail. What does this downgrade mean for you and I on the street?
For ordinary consumers on the streets, I think in the short term our monies are very safe in the big four banks because they are much more established compared to ABL itself, which is a much smaller lender compared to the big four banks. And then also they have very strong balance sheets compared to ABL as well. They have a different business model, different target markets. And then at the same time, we also know that our financial sector is quite viable, and then it was actually quite resilient after the global financial crisis in 2008.
So there's no reason for us to completely panic and start shoving our money under our mattresses or anything like that?
In the short term, there is no worry, but I'm more worried about the fundamental issues regarding this, because the collapse of ABL, it's basically just the tip of the iceberg. Because if you look at our economic strength currently in the market, it is very, very weak. Maybe we were able to avoid a recession after the second quarter and maintain a slightly positive growth rate in the economy. However, it was much lower than what everybody was expected. And then if the situation continues, then it could possibly lead to a more bigger problem, such as the further sovereign downgrade, which the South African government cannot afford to do that. We know that Friday the 13th of June, S&P has downgraded the South African sovereign bond in the market to nearly just the lowest level of the investment grade, which would basically have a very bad implication for South African government to basically borrow money or raise capital in the international markets.
Now, as you've mentioned, further downgrades is something that we, of course, want to avoid. So what do the banks need to do to ensure that this doesn't happen? And is there a way to come back from this? Can the bank be upgraded?
I think in the short term, for the banks to be upgraded is very difficult, because we know the National Development Plan has a series of measures to ensure the sustainable growth for the future. But the plan has to be implemented, and to see the result that eventually contribute to sustainable economic growth, it takes some time. So I think for the banks, we learned a couple of things. For example, we have to diversify our customers, and we also have to diversify the sources of our funding. So in addition to that, we have to stop and avoid reckless lending. So these things are all very important. Touch on the bigger issue, you will probably expect the government to start make some amendments or changes in their policies, and for example, the credit regulation as well. I mean, we have to try to find a way that we can provide the masses affordable credit, and which would then stimulate the economic growth in the country. Yeah, like we know a lot of households, or for example, micro borrowers in the market. I mean, they are actually subject to kind of emolument attachment order. Means that when they couldn't afford to pay, the employers could actually deduct a certain portion of their salaries and directly transfer to the creditors. It works well when the market is doing okay and employment rate is quite good. But then in terms of sluggish economic growth, interest rate hikes, and then the economic slowdown overall, and then in that case, employees, they lose their jobs, and then to recover the debts for the creditors become very, very difficult.
Would you agree that this is an issue that goes all the way down to the ground when it comes to strikes in the mining industry and in the metal workers industry, for instance? This all has a knock-on effect now of the banks being downgraded.
Yes, definitely. Definitely. The strikes basically put the country in a very bad sentiment internationally, and we can see that the foreign capital actually flow out of South Africa, which give us a lot of pressure on the rand values. So instead, and that is why we started seeing the interest rate hikes that to bring the capital back to the South Africa.
Now, if we take a step back and look at it from an international perspective, does our banks being downgraded put us in a bad standing when it comes to foreign investment?
Definitely, definitely, and we will probably see further pressures on the rand values.
So that's something that we need to really avoid then.
Because strikes is like no work, no pay. So in the economy, that if you don't get paid, I mean, you don't have the basic consumers' needs. So if you can't spend, then every participant in the market suffers.